Hello, everyone. Welcome. We will be getting started with the webinar in just a couple more minutes to give a few more people time to come on in. And before we get started, while we're waiting, just to let you know, if you have any particular questions or whatnot, feel free to drop them in the question box. You can also comment in the chat if you'd like, but if you have any comments, if you have any particular questions for our speaker today or for myself, you can feel free to add those into the questions. And I'll give it one more minute and then we'll get started. And there's always kind of like that awkward part. Okay. All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today, bringing quality design systems to life with Storybook and Applitools, brought to you by our awesome speaker, Mr. Colby Fayok. Colby works with the dev community as a developer advocate at Applitools. You can find him helping others learn JavaScript, React, and other web tools with articles, video tutorials, courses, and books. Colby, I'm going to go ahead and pass control over to you. So there we go. I think you already have control. Okay.
So we're good to go?
Yes.
Okay. Well, hey everyone, today we're going to talk about design systems and how we can bring them to life while maintaining a high level of quality. So who am I? I'm Colby Fayok. I'm the one hugging BB-8 and Kylo Ren over there. I work with the dev community as a developer advocate with Applitools. You can find me pretty much anywhere on the web by just Googling my name, as I'm the only one in the world. So let's start off by browsing the web a little bit. Here we have Airbnb. The site is driven by a minimal UI that relies heavily on photography. We can see that throughout their site, we generally get the same look and feel. While it's hard to keep user-generated photos consistent, any curated imagery from Airbnb all has the same style. Any UI elements get the same treatment and color scheme. Maybe you've used Airbnb to book your last trip, or maybe you've never even heard of it, but I would imagine you're all pretty familiar with this page. But you may or may not have noticed that anytime you visit a Google-owned page, it looks like it was made from the exact same team. This goes for both their marketing pages, where you can get a peek at how tools like Photos and their marketing platform work, to the actual UI of their applications, like checking up on my Google account or using Google Drive to access documents. But what both Airbnb are doing, or what both Airbnb and Google are doing, as well as a lot of other companies around the world, is they're using design systems to create consistent experiences. But what exactly is a design system? There's not really a single thing that makes up a system, but rather a collection of things and ideas that ultimately build a system. Let's break down a few pieces of what makes up a design system. One common way people typically see design systems is through components. If you're not familiar with the concept of a component, each little building block of a website or application is typically created as a component. So each piece you see here, the search bar, the buttons, the inputs, they're all created as components. You can even have components inside of components, like how the banner and the search bar have buttons inside of them. But these are going to be the building blocks of a system. It also includes the imagery that's used. If you look at Airbnb's marketing pages, meaning the images that aren't uploaded from the hosts that are just uploading pictures of their own profiles, they have a consistent look and feel. They all have a sort of peacefulness to it that carry the same vibe and stylistic effects. They all feel inviting, making you want to go there and take a relaxing trip. And all of those pieces generally build on top of a style guide. The style guide can include really as much or as little as you want. Sometimes people include components and images as part of a style guide, which is okay, but typically a style guide focuses on design fundamentals, like typography, or making sure that you're using the same fonts everywhere, or colors to make sure that all the colors match and work well together. This guide ultimately defines the set of guidelines, or loosely a set of rules, that are used throughout the project. And typically, you'll see these style guides, images, and components used to reflect the brand. In this instance, we've been looking at Airbnb, where you can see these exact colors and components represented on their site. I say usually because this isn't always the case, where if you're using an open source component library like Bootstrap, like I'm showing here, these styles are specific to the Bootstrap theme, not a particular brand. So components, images, styles, why is any of this stuff even important? Well, the first thing is consistency. The hope and goal is that wherever you use Airbnb, you're going to get the same look and feel. You're going to get the same Airbnb colors, the same Airbnb font, and the same styles of images. You know that what to expect whenever you're using one of their apps or their websites, and it's connected to their brand. By leveraging the design system, you're also allowing designers and developers to focus on bigger problems because they don't have to worry about what colors to use, or because they can pick out a component from a library, they're now able to spend more time on how to solve particular problems. If it makes the most sense to add a date picker to the application, they don't need to solve that date picker again. They have one available. They can think about where it makes the most sense to add that date picker and how it's incorporated into a user's flow. And with both that consistency and focus, you pretty much by default get improved efficiency. While you get more time to focus on bigger challenges, you're also able to more quickly iterate and get new work out. You might not have to wait for a completely new custom design, giving the ability to rapidly get out new pages using existing systems. This also helps when working with larger teams at scale, where there could be different teams working on different parts. But rather than spending that time with a design review bottleneck, you're able to have pre-approved components that developers can use. Now, hopefully you found that as compelling as I do. There are a lot of benefits to getting design systems set up, but how do we actually get started? So as you might have guessed, that's where Storybook comes in. If you're not quite familiar with Storybook yet, it's a JavaScript-based tool for developers to build UI components. It supports a variety of UI frameworks like React, Vue, and Angular, most of the popular ones, and provides a way to create and organize a library of components. One of the cool parts about Storybook is they make it really easy to set up. Let's just zoom in on that quick. It's just that simple command. If you already have a project created, like if you use create React app, like we'll actually see later, or Next.js, you can run this init command and Storybook will first detect what kind of project you have, and then it will install Storybook based on that configuration. Like I said, we'll dig into this a little bit more later. But as you start building out your components in Storybook, you begin to create a library of components. This is useful for all stakeholders of a project. Of course, for developers, this is going to provide a more focused environment for somebody to work in. For designers, this can also provide a way to work more closely with the developers, or even in the code where it makes sense, just to make sure everything is perfect. And testers also get a focused environment to make sure everything is working properly. And while integration is still incredibly important to that process, it provides a great way with automated ways, wink, that can help maintain quality with each focused component. But like we talked a little bit about that earlier, that gives you a great way to rapidly build new projects, which leads to this doubling as a form of documentation. Storybook supports adding source code right to the project. So you can hop in here and you can find which component actually makes sense for your project at that time. It has standard documentation formats, allowing you to let others know how to use those components. So this all seems pretty cool, right? So let's see a quick few examples of who else is using Storybook. So here's an example of The Guardian, which is a popular news and media platform who really needs their UI to be easy to read, so people can easily digest all those current events. Or we have Shopify, the e-commerce platform, whose design system is called Polaris. They need to make sure they're providing a reliable experience for both customers and shop owners. And IBM, whose design system is called Carbon. They need to provide a consistent UI for their cloud services. So as you can imagine, products like Shopify have a ton of different components, and those components are critical for all those shop owners to be able to work on their different sites, or for people to actually go through and make purchases on those sites. So how can we make sure that when we're building all those different components, we can maintain a high level of quality? And as great as it is to have the ability to easily add new components, that number of components can quickly balloon, leaving you with a huge library without enough developer time to maintain all of those. So how can you make sure those things aren't breaking before the customers tell you that? This also lends itself to user experience. Oftentimes you have dependencies between different components. or simply package updates that might change how a component actually looks. So if you're not careful to check each component, you might upgrade your CSS library and accidentally break a critical component. When that component breaks, that's going to be broken everywhere that component is used throughout your application or website. That's severely hurting the usability of your app. And realistically, every developer shouldn't have to be responsible for every single time that component is used throughout an app. This is where Applitools comes in. Applitools is an automated visual testing platform, powered by AI, might I add, that automatically ensures that you're maintaining a high level of quality for all your apps. By running Applitools eyes on your project, you're using real images that show what the users of your website or app are actually seeing. This is critical, where a broken image might not show up in a failed test, but by using visual testing, you can make sure that you're catching all those user-facing bugs. In our context, we're talking about Storybook, of course, but Applitools supports a wide variety of SDKs, from web-based testing frameworks like Cypress and Selenium, to native platforms like Appium and Espresso. Whatever testing framework you're using, Applitools likely supports and will help you to immediately get productive. But in our particular use case with Storybook, it's maintaining that quality for our library of components. The way it works is when you run your Applitools locally on your machine or in a CI/CD process, Applitools will first suck in all of those components from your Storybook. Once that happens, it will use Puppeteer under the hood to render out all those components, including taking DOM snapshots of all those components. And if you're not familiar with what the DOM is, it's the document object model, which is the underlying tree of elements that are inside of the browser. But with all those snapshots, Applitools will use its visual grid, and depending on your configuration, to generate those screenshots. Where finally, Applitools eyes will use machine learning to compare those images and intelligently look for differences, where it will then show those differences inside of the UI. So to do this, you can use the Applitools Eyes Storybook. It's SDK. It's an NPM package that makes it really easy to install right inside of your existing Node project. And to see how that all works, we're going to actually run through a demo of adding Storybook to a new React project from scratch. So here's what we're going to go through. We're going to first set up a new React application. We're going to use create React app. We'll then install Storybook on top of that, where we'll actually be able to see what Storybook looks like. Then we'll install Applitools for our automated visual testing, where we'll run some tests and actually see how that works. So let's get started here. All right. So here we can see create React app. It's actually right inside of the React documentation, where if we scroll down here, we can see that to create a new React application, we can run this command npx create React app. So I'm going to open up my terminal, and inside there, I'm going to use yarn instead of npx, which it's really up to you what you use, npx or yarn, but I'm going to run yarn create create React. Got to minimize the webinar thing. Yarn create React app, and let's call this my Storybook components. So what this is now going to do is it's going to go through the application. It's going to basically clone a template. It's going to install all the dependencies for this React project, and it's basically going to scaffold a new React project for us so that we can immediately get productive. So it might take a little second for this to actually finish installing. Almost done here. But once it does, we can see that we can cd into that Storybook components directory. We can run yarn start, where it's going to take that project, it's going to spin up a development server. And after compiles and loads, we can see we have our new React project. So that's great. And if we actually want to see what that looks like inside of the project, whether or not you're actually familiar with React itself, but it's just a standard application where we have an app.js and we can see everything that we saw inside of the UI, where we have our image, which is that logo, and we have that edit screen as well as the link. So we're not going to actually do too much inside of the React application itself, but this just goes to show you that we are really easily able to create a new React application, which we can now start testing with. So to get started with Storybook instead, let's head back over to our browser where we talked about earlier that Storybook is a way to develop components and it supports the popular frameworks like React, which is what we're going to use, but it also supports Vue and Angular if that's the kind of thing that you'd like to do. And the nice thing about Storybook is it also makes it really easy to install because we can use that npx sb init command where it's going to detect our project. So let's actually see how that works. So I'm going to copy that command and go back over to my project, and I'm going to run that. And similar to what we did with the Yarn Create React app, it's going to first go out and find all the dependencies that it needs to do, that it needs to work. It's going to install all those dependencies, and it's going to set up and configure Storybook inside of our application. So this might take a few seconds for it to actually finish. As we can see, it's detecting the project type where it knows that it's React. Should be almost done here. But now, as it says, once it's finished and all the dependencies are installed, we can try running Yarn Storybook, which also is going to take a few seconds to load. Because what's happening here is it's taking all the stories that it added to our project, which we'll look at a second here, but it's taking those, it's going to compile it into a development server where it's going to actually allow us to browse that storybook right inside of our browser. And as we see, it's done, it's opening it up inside of our browser, and we get a beautiful welcome message. So what we get out of the box with Storybook is we get a few different components by default. So particularly some of the interesting ones, which let me see if I can move this down here. It's not letting me. Gonna minimize the browser again. There we go. So this particular one is a pretty familiar one, which is just simply a button, but it gives us a bunch of controls that we can actually change to dynamically look at how this component can be used. And that's all done. If you're familiar with the concept of React, it gives a way for us to control the props of that component. So for instance, in this button, we have a prop called label, where if I change it to my name, like Colby, we can see that that dynamically updated right in the inside of the component. But this goes and the same for every one of these components and the variations of those components, where here we also have a header that shows a different state for when somebody is logged in and when somebody's logged out. So this is great, and this is just really a starting point. Let's see what this looks like inside of the code itself. So if we look inside of the stories directory, which Storybook added for us, we can see a bunch of new components. We have our button, which this is the actual component. We can see that label that we talked about before, and this is the code that's rendering that button inside of our page. But we also have this button.stories.js file, which here we're importing and defining that button as an example inside of our project. So then we can create these different variations and we can use them as different stories. So the great thing about this is it gives us a lot of control for how we can kind of self-document our different components inside of our project. Now, what we talked about earlier before is this is really just a few different components that we got as a demo. But imagine if you've been working on this project for months or even just a couple of weeks where you're rapidly working with a team to build out a big library of components. As that scales, that gets trickier and trickier to actually maintain that high level of quality, which is where we're going to bring in Applitools to solve that. So as we talked about, Applitools is our visual testing platform, which we're going to use to provide automated visual testing inside of our application. And to do that, we're going to use the Applitools Eyes Storybook SDK, which and you can see the theme here, similar to the other packages that we installed, this Applitools makes it really easy to set up. So the first thing we need to do is we need to add the Eyes Storybook dependency to our project. So I'm going to go back to my terminal. I'm going to add yarn add our Applitools Storybook, and I'm going to save it as a dev dependency. Just like before, it's going to get out and it's going to actually install the dependency for us. Was hoping the dependencies were a little bit quicker and snappier today, but we're almost done here. Cool. So now we have iStorybook actually installed inside of our application. So if we look next in this usage here, we see that we're going to need our Applitools API key. Now, if this is your first time using Applitools, you can head on over to the Applitools website and you can actually get started for free. Now, I already have an account, so I'm going to just log into my existing account, which now I already have a few tests that I ran before, but if this is your first time here, you're not going to really see much until we're going to actually run tests. Now, the critical thing inside of the dashboard that you want to have when you're going to actually run your tests is the API key, which you can find inside this dropdown up here under My API Key. Now, I'm not going to click that so that I don't show my sensitive API key on the screen, but I created an API key specifically for this demo that I'll be able to use and show you. So let's bring back up my terminal and the SDK documentation, where we want to first export our Applitools API key. So I'm going to run export Applitools API key, and I'm going to set that equal to my key that I told you I created. So now we have that Applitools API key available inside of our environment. So now all we have to do is copy this iStorybook command, and let's give it a try. So the first thing Applitools is going to do is it's going to start the Storybook server in the background. So what it's essentially doing is it's going to start Storybook, it's going to suck in all of those components, and it's going to use that as a basis for running the tests on it. So now we can see that it's reading all those stories. We have 8 of them, including all of those individual stories and all the variations of those stories. And we can see that no differences was found. But we also have this list where we see all of these new tests that were added for our project. Now, this is going to serve as our baseline. So let's actually see what this looks like inside of our project if we open it up using this link. So we can see this is our first new test, and all of these different tests, if we look inside, we see exactly the same thing that we saw inside of Storybook itself. Because what Applitools is doing is it's basically taking a snapshot, a screenshot of all of those different stories, where if we look back inside of our project, we can see the exact same thing. So as we can go through, we have a new baseline for all of our new components right inside of Storybook. Now, let's test this out to see what actually happens if we try simply running that again. Just like before, it's going to start the Storybook server. Going to read all those stories. And we can see it's almost done. It went through and processed all of those stories. So now we can see the exact same message, no differences were found, but instead of new, each of these say past. Now let's look at and see what that looks like inside of our dashboard. Instead of clicking that link, I'm going to simply load the latest batches, where instead of just simply having those screenshots, we can look at these and compare it to the previous, which we can see it called the baseline inside of our dashboard, where this is that first set of tests that we ran. So when we ran this new checkpoint, this new test, it's comparing that new screenshot to the previous one. Now, we didn't make any changes to that, so it's kind of expected that it would look the same and that we would actually have the passing checks. But what happens if we actually make a change inside of it that we don't want? So to test this out, I'm going to go back inside of the application and I'm going to open up the header.js file. Now, you don't necessarily need to know how to do this inside of React, but what I'm going to do here is if we notice inside of our particular story, which I'm going to spin back up my storybook in the background, in our story, we had a state where if it's logged in, it's going to show us the log out button, but if it's logged out, it's going to show the login and sign up button. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to simply reverse that. So I'm going to say the opposite, where if we don't have a user, we're going to send the log out button. And the reason that I'm doing this is simply to test out that this functionality is working. So now when somebody is logged in, they're going to see the login button, which isn't actually what we want to see happen. Now let's see what happens when we run Applitools now. So again, it's going to start back up that Storybook server. And once it's done, we can see that we now see a total of 4 differences. We have 4 unresolved tests inside of our project. Now let's go back into Applitools and see what happened. So if we refresh the test again, we can see our unresolved item. If we look inside of here and we look at any of our items, we see we can zoom in here, that we have our highlighted item here where we don't want this to say sign up or log in. We want it to say log out. So Applitools is flagging that for us so that we know that we now have a broken part of our functionality and we need to address that. Now, I don't want that change to be saved as our new baseline. If I did, I could hit thumbs up, but I want to reject that and say that that's not correct. So I'm going to reject it as well as the other ones inside of this test. I'm going to click continue. And I'm going to make sure it's saved, which it is, but now we can see that because we rejected all those tests, that it's now failed. But let's revert that change and let's run it one more time and let's see what happens. As usual, it's starting up the Storybook server. Going through all the different stories. And we can see that no differences were found. So let's refresh the page. So this is still running. It's going to be passed in a second here, but if we look back at our test, we can see that it's actually correct because we refer to that change. And because we didn't save that original baseline, we're in a good place where it's going to check against that original baseline and make sure that it's right, which because we reverted that change, it is. So we're good to go here. We have all these passed, but what happens if you have a particular piece inside of the header, which is something that might change between the different users, but something that you want to make sure isn't going to be flagged every time there's a change? So back inside of our application, let us open up our header, where here, when somebody is logged in, we're going to add a little bit of code here. We're right next to this button. We're just going to simply say our user.name. I'm going to actually make that a span, and I'm going to give that a class name of my user, just for testing purposes. If we go back into our story, I'm going to open Storybook in the background. But if we open up our story, we can see that by default, this empty user object is being passed in. So I can add that new property right to it and say Colby Fayok. And let's see what happens after Storybook loads inside of our browser. Great. So we can see that when we're logged in, we're showing Colby Fayok, which in our case is statically added inside of that user object. I'm also going to add a nice little space next to that just so that we have a little breathing room. But let's see what happens when we try to run this test with Storybook again. As usual, it's starting up the server. And once the server started up, it's able to quickly go through and scrape all those different stories. But now, again, we see those unresolved differences. So let's look back inside of our project, refresh it, and we can see that we have these 2 unresolved items. If we look inside, we see that we're getting flagged for that new name there, which is something that we actually want. Now, since we do want our user's name there, we're going to simply say yes, thumbs up, because that's a change that we want to make. We can continue. And now what we're doing is we're setting our new baseline to this new image with my name in it. So now what will happen if we go back in here and we can change this name? What if we change it to something like Angie Jones, where I'm going to save that and I'm going to again run iStorybook. If you're out there, try to guess as this is loading what you think is going to actually happen. Now it's reading the stories. And if you said that you were expecting it to find a difference, well, you were right. It's unresolved, and we do have a total of 2 differences. So let's see what those look like. If we go inside of our project, we can see that if we open this up, it's because my name doesn't match Angie's. Now, if you look up here, we just got an applet tip where we can consider adding an ignore region to this particular checkpoint. So when we say ignore region, and we can preview this for a few seconds, it's going to add this highlighted space. Let's do that one more time. It's a little hard, it's small to see, but you can see that highlighted space inside of our project where it's going to consider that region ignored for us. So if we want to say yes, that's going to say we're going to ignore that region. And we're actually good to go here, and we can hit thumbs up. Now, if we go back over to a second one, we can see that we don't automatically get that tooltip because this is actually a second time opening up this particular test. So we can go up into annotations and we can select ignore region, where we can actually draw that same box right inside of our project. And we're going to say that we want that to ignore that spot. So now, again, we're going to actually save that. And we're going to continue. I'm going to close that out. But now we can see after we save this, this is going to be our new baseline. So I currently have Angie's name out there, but what if I change that now back to Colby Fayok? Let's run that test one more time. And again, as this is starting up and reading the stories, what do you think is going to actually happen this time? Almost done here. And this time we found no differences. So if you guessed that, you were right. And why did that happen? Well, let's refresh this and look at our tests. And inside of the logged in, let's go inside the header for logged in. We can see that we do see a difference between my name and Angie's name. But if we click that, we can see that that particular spot has an ignore region on it, which means it's going to say, we don't want this to be captured as part of the test, or rather we want it to ignore that region whenever it's running the difference checks to make sure that we don't actually consider that a red flag if we're running our test. So now we both have visual testing ready to go on side of our Storybook component library, but we also have visual testing, which is really easily done simply by using the iStorybook SDK, and we're good to go and ready for a high quality component system. So I'm going to go back over to my slides. All right, so just to kind of reiterate, let's recap what we just achieved there. So first, we were able to successfully set up a new React application where we then went ahead and we installed and set up Storybook. We were able to kind of see what you got by default and what all is included with Storybook. Then, in order to maintain that high level of quality, we were able to install and use Applitools, where by using that Storybook SDK, we were able to run our first automated visual test on our entire component library very quickly, which was able to catch our UI bugs as we were actually testing that out inside of our project. So if you want to add Applitools Eyes to your project, you can find that Applitools Eyes SDK right on NPM. If you want to check out how this works, we also have a tutorial for Storybook right on applitools.com/tutorials. You can also check out my tutorial right on the Applitools blog where I show you how to add Storybook just like we did today to an existing project. And that's it. If you want to learn more or chat about the talk, you can find me everywhere at Colby Fayok. You can find all the links that I talked about today at the link here, and I'm going to also tweet that out so it's easy to find and put it in the chat. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you so much, Colby. Okay, so we do actually have quite a few questions in the chat.
Awesome.
Let me get started here. The first one, this is from Pablo. What do you think about making exhaustive steps on the test cases that are going to be automatized?
Exhaustive steps on the test cases that are going
Test
to be,
cases?
okay.
Right, that would be automated.
So do you mean like running specific steps on each of the different components? I'm not 100% following the question.
Okay. Pablo, if you are still with us, if you can please go ahead and type some clarification in the question panel. And we're going to go ahead and start on the next question. So this one's from Mauricio. What technical topics do you consider necessary to learn before starting to work with Storybook?
Sure. So it probably just really depends on the different framework that you like to use. If I'm not mistaken, they might actually support default HTML without having any JavaScript framework on top, as a aside from Storybook itself, of course. But being able to be familiar with the command line where you can install packages with npm and really whatever framework of your choice to work with, really installing Storybook from there is a pretty simple thing. Like you saw, we were able to run that init command inside the terminal, and that it'll detect your project type and it'll install everything you need for Storybook, and you'll be able to get started right away. So there's very few things that you need to know about getting started with Storybook in terms of getting it installed on your project. Rather, it's just being familiar with the framework or whatever it is you're going to install that on top of.
Okay. With Applitools, can we test accessibility issues?
Yes, we can. It's limited as to what you can actually do in terms of the accessibility, but there definitely are features in order to test accessibility. I'd have to get back to you on the actual list of the features that we are able to test actively, but I know that we can.
Okay. And can we use Applitools for code reviews?
Yeah, so you would want to figure out a way to incorporate that inside of your existing workflow. So for instance, I started creating a GitHub action where I'm going to have it set up so that whenever somebody creates a new pull request, we're going to be able to run those tests on each of those pull requests to make sure that the changes aren't going to break existing workflow. And the way that you can do that is by associating things like a commit ID or a pull request ID to that change set for when it's going to run inside of the pull request. So if you want to check out my particular action, it's you can Google Applitools eyes action. That should pull up for you right on GitHub. But there's also, you can run Storybook, for instance, right inside of your project on pull request. And the only difference is, unless you install the Applitools integration alongside of that, which we have articles on how to do that on the blog, you might not necessarily get those get the messages with the changes in line inside of the pull request. But it's definitely a capability that you have as long as you set up the integration.
Okay. I'm going to piggyback on that one with, can we test some actions with Applitools, for instance, save data versus delete data, and can we identify those kind of mistakes?
So saving data and deleting data inside of Storybook, are you referring to the component? I'm going to go and assume that you're talking about the component saving and deleting. And I don't know if it would be considered like typical practice for the component inside of Storybook to actively be able to like read and write data. I'm not sure if that's the case. I know, so if you're using something like Cypress instead of the Storybook eyes action, where you can actually interface with like the file system and mock files and stuff, you're absolutely able to kind of coordinate that with the component testing, where if if you inside of Cypress, if you run the test where you upload the file, you can test the input and output, the mock files, and you can also run you can run Applitools on top of that so that it's going to see what it looks like at every step of the way to make sure that it's running just as you expect. And to on top of that, we actually just released an automation cookbook where I show you how to do that in Cypress, and Angie shows you how to do that in Selenium Java. So head over to applitools.com/cookbook for that.
Awesome. Okay, Mauricio, that was his question that he had, and he was saying to elaborate when you're clicking save button, but the fact delete data. I'm not sure if that helps to clarify what he was asking there.
Is it still like inside of the component, you mean? Like you're providing those actions inside of the component? Sorry for the need for the clarification there.
No problem. I'm just going to relay this directly to Mauricio.
And feel free to reach out afterwards. My Twitter is @ColbyFayok, and I'd be happy to track down the answer if I can't answer it on this Q&A.
Okay, he did say yes, the action of components.
Okay. So I'm not entirely sure of that answer. If you're trying to work specifically inside of Storybook to do that. But again, I'd be happy to try to find that answer and track it down for you so that I can give you a good answer on that.
Okay. Next question, how can we integrate this with CI/CD?
Sure. So I think my favorite instance, and if you've seen any of my stuff, I really enjoy GitHub Actions. And I think that's probably my favorite way to do it. I think it's a great example because the workflow for setting up the CI/CD process can really be duplicated into any other process. So for instance, with Jenkins, you of course have more control over that workflow, but inside of a GitHub action, we're really just running that command line script whenever we do it. So for instance, if I wanted to run Applitools eyes anytime that I have a pull request, I can trigger a GitHub action where it runs that workflow on pull request, and it'll go through, it'll run npx eyes storybook, and it'll do the exact same thing that you see. It'll go through, it'll capture the screenshots, and it'll upload it to the Applitools cloud. Now, the thing that you want to consider there is kind of what I mentioned a little bit ago, is that you want to be able to, especially if you're trying to do it for pull request sake, you want to be able to relate that batch name to a particular part of the Git workflow. So for instance, whether that's a commit ID or a pull request ID, you want to be able to relate that batch name so that anytime you're making that screenshot upload from your pull request workflow, it's not comparing it between your baseline, which would probably be your main branch. You would want to be comparing for your new branch to make sure that it's tracking for new issues as opposed to issues that are already merged in. It's a mouthful. Hopefully that makes sense. But if you look up on the Applitools GitHub account for the Storybook tutorial, I do have an example of a GitHub action right inside of that, which you should be able to take and kind of integrate in whatever CI/CD process that you use.
Okay. Next question, I see you're running this logo. Can this be run against a test environment?
So my question there is which part of it? So the test environment, I don't see why not, because really, so for instance, in the example of CI/CD, you're really, sorry, just connecting the dots here. Okay, so with Storybook, that's a good question. I'm not sure if there's an advanced configuration to do that. Again, that's something I could try to find out. I just haven't run across that particular use case yet. Because typically what we'll do isn't, like inside of the GitHub action, for instance, is that code will already be checked out. So it'll start that Storybook server locally, as opposed to hitting the compiled out Storybook instance, which might be what you're talking about.
Okay. And I'm gonna skip around here a little bit. For the ignore region, can you confirm something is there, but keep it non-specific, i.e. there has to be a name, we just don't care what the name is?
Yeah, so you can get intelligent with the different regions that you set. Like we have different match levels such as layout and content. So you can definitely do some more advanced configurations for how that is. I would recommend checking out the documentation for that. Like if you search, I think if you search Google, for instance, for like Applitools match level, you should be able to find the documentation that actually talks. Yeah, it should be if you search Applitools match levels, you'll see the match levels at the top, but you should be able to configure those match levels for any story you want. So if you want to actually make those match levels specific to one individual component, you can do that. Or if you want to make it globally, where you set a particular selector or something, you can do that also globally. So I would recommend checking out the SDK documentation for how to set those different regions, and then the match levels documentation for what those match levels actually mean.
Okay. Here's one of our common questions for Applitools. How is visual testing better than just snapshot testing?
Okay, so in regards to Storybook, let me first set up this question. So in regards to Storybook, there's kind of two concepts of a snapshot. With Storybook, you have story shots, which is considered snapshot testing, which is actually the HTML. And then you also have snapshots that might just be considered a static image, which is kind of along the lines of where Applitools fits in. Now, if you're doing the HTML, like the rendered component snapshots, that's going to be code-based and really checking the difference between two strings. And that works, but it's very fragile, because imagine if you make little changes to any kind of HTML, and you might have a change that goes across all components. Like, it's going to be very difficult to scale and actually find out where those changes are happening. And it just becomes a bear to try to actually keep up with, where with snapshot testing, visual testing in general, it's going to give you a better experience, and you're going to be able to be smarter about how you're actually looking for those changes. Now, talking about the visual side of things, comparing the two, typically when you're talking about visual snapshots, you're talking about the screenshots, and the way that Applitools differs from the majority of the different solutions out there is that instead of by using pixel by pixel matching, which is what most of those solutions do, we use actual AI to run machine learning and actual intelligence on those different screenshots. So for instance, we saw in the different in the demo earlier where we pushed out that button change as well as the name change, it's going to compare that one-to-one and actually see where that tiny pixel actually changed, and it's only going to flag something like that. Where with Applitools, it's going to actually understand the differences between what's actually happening, like the match levels, where you can see that it's a layout change as opposed to a content change. And we can be very aware of that, and we can flag it and give a lot less false positives. And it's just generally going to be a better experience for how you're trying to test.
Okay. Will Applitools work in an intranet?
That's a good question. I know that there are custom server solutions. I don't know how that works in terms of an intranet. If you reach out to me, I'd be happy to try to find that out for you.
And a couple more. Let's see. So can Applitools integrate with project management tools like Jira and creating tickets to work?
Great question. I believe that there are integrations. I haven't used them yet. So I'll say with confidence, I'm pretty sure, but I can't guarantee that. So again, if you want to reach out to me, I can definitely find that out for you, but I think there is.
Okay. And there
Yeah.
was a response back to one of the questions that was asking about running it in a test environment. And Jules said, we test against an IDE, the code is deployed to, and I guess you can have Applitools run on Azure at the deployment.
Okay. So it's running locally on the deployment environment? I'm sorry, I'm still not quite following.
Right. This was in response to his, I see you're running this local, can this be run against a test environment? And that was kind of the response that he came back on with it, that they're testing against an IDE. The code is deployed to, and he guesses that we can have Applitools run on Azure at the deployment.
Oh, sure. So I think that hopefully I'm understanding this right now. So it sounds like on a test server. So you might be spinning up a new environment in order to run those specific tests, and absolutely. So that's similar to exactly what GitHub Actions does, where it'll spin up a test environment, a virtual environment, where it's going to first check out your code. It'll then install the dependencies. It'll then run Storybook, where Applitools eyes will spin up that server and pull everything out to the cloud. So absolutely, that should work completely fine if that's what you're kind of referring to.
Okay. With Applitools, can we disable some stories to test?
I believe so. Again, that's something I haven't done yet, so I would have to imagine, but I don't know that exact answer for sure. Again, feel free to reach out to me, and I definitely will track down that answer for you.
Does Applitools store any customer data?
I don't know that answer as well. I would, I can't really speak on that. I don't want to say the wrong thing with that, but as usual, I'd be happy to find out that answer and get back to you.
Okay. Let's see. It looks like there's two parts in this question. If developers are using this in CI/CD prior to committing code to the main branch, how do they develop a baseline? And can those images be pulled from a central repository, or does a developer have to create them, QA them himself?
Sure. So kind of getting back to that GitHub Actions workflow that I was talking about with pull request, when you first have your main branch is going to create that baseline, and it's going to be, your baseline will always be represented, as long as you're relating it properly. Let me prefix that. It should be always related to the main branch. So when you run any test on the main branch, it'll always refer to that main branch. Now, when you're doing it with a pull request, you're going to want to have a unique ID, which again, that could be a commit ID, it could be a pull request ID, but something where you're going to relate that new baseline to that new branch, so that anytime those changes are made and you run the test, it's going to relate it to that batch as opposed to the main branch, so that you're not kind of mixing those two streams. Hopefully that makes sense.
Okay. If Applitools is run before committing code, this would mean they have to resolve, update the baseline locally and rerun, get a clean run. Can they then update the shared baseline for the future?
So I don't think you don't necessarily have to be running Applitools before you commit code. I think that's just kind of what I did as part of my demo. You can really run Applitools at um, any part of that flow that you want. Honestly, I'd recommend after committing, because if you're doing it before commit, who knows if changes are going to be added after that. So being able to test it with what you're actually going to be pushing the code out would probably be more recommended. And what was the second part of that question?
Um, the second part was, can they then update the shared baseline for the future?
Sure. So it probably depends on what you're trying to do. I know you can upload images inside of the dashboard as a baseline, but then it just becomes a little bit trickier to match that. You're going to need to be able to relate that baseline that you upload to the test. So that becomes a little tricky in that part of it.
Okay. So this question, they're looking for a little bit more insight into how Storybook works. Do you create those different states in Storybook itself, or do you need to create the props in the project and then you can update it in Storybook?
Yeah, so the Storybook is essentially just wrapping your React components. So any of those props that you create have to already exist inside of the React component. What Storybook will do, though, is it'll create a framework where you can set up multiple instances of that component, but then you can use different props for each of those different variations of the story. So you're not able to develop, like you're not able to create the props inside of the Storybook. You have to have the props already existing, where then you can use Storybook to basically test and show those different variations of the props.
And this was a response on the previous question asking about the branches. So running Applitools would be on the entire release instead of a branch.
Well, that depends on your workflow. Like you should be able to run it on a branch, but again, you would need to relate that batch ID so that it's relating the snapshots and any of the subsequent snapshots to that particular batch, as opposed to running all of the same things on the same baseline, which is going to kind of mix those different streams of your main branch and your separate branch.
Okay.
Hopefully that answers.
All right. Well, that wraps up the questions that we have in the question box there. Let's see if anything else is coming through. Nothing else right now. So thank you very much, Colby. I'm sorry, there was one more question did pop in.
No worries.
Can I view my Applitools baseline snapshots in Storybook?
No, I don't believe you can.
Okay.
Yeah, because what's happening is when you run Storybook, or when you run Eyes Storybook, it's going to spin up that Storybook server and just take a snapshot of what's already there, and it's going to upload that to the cloud. So that screenshot won't really be available locally.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Colby. Let's see, that wraps up the questions that we have. We definitely appreciate everyone for joining us and hope that you enjoyed the presentation. Some very good, engaging questions. If you are interested in exploring any additional events with us, we hope you consider joining us for our next one, which is going to be about Playwright. And it's actually Playwright, a new test automation framework for the modern web. In that webinar presentation, Andrei Lushnikov, a principal engineer at Microsoft, will share his insights into the decisions behind the creation and development of Playwright and how Playwright is the best tool that covers modern automation needs, including being the first framework that can be used for cross-browser testing. That webinar will take place April 29th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. You can use this link that I'm going to place in the chat to actually sign up for that webinar and share with your network if you like.
Awesome. And again, if anybody has any questions about anything that you've seen here today, feel free to reach out to me. My DMs are open. I'd be happy to try to answer some of those questions that I wasn't able to answer live here. But in the meantime, everything that you've seen today, you're able to do absolutely free with Applitools. So you can head on over to applitools.com where you can sign up for a free account and start running your Storybook tests or really any other testing framework that we have an SDK available for. So thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Colby. Thank you for joining us. Everyone have a great day.